On the train to Istanbul, Turkey, a middle-aged man named Robert McCall, who might be a Muslim, is reading a book. A family of 4, a father, a mother, and their little daughter, are all on the same train. Robert discreetly followed the father as he stepped into a different carriage a short while later. Shortly afterward, Robert tailed behind the man to a food car. They started up a conversation when Robert met the guy. The stranger continued by wondering as to Robert's reason for visiting Turkey. Robert, who was enjoying a drink, explained that he had traveled to Turkey in search of a Turkish man who had a daughter from a marriage to a British woman. He went on to tell the man that the Turkish man he was trying to find was a violent abuser who had harmed his own wife and taken his daughter to Turkey against her will. The man eventually understood that Robert was seeking him after hearing Robert explain the whole thing. Some of his guys happened to be on the train, so he gave them orders to beat Robert. Robert, an exceptionally skilled and brilliant former U.S. Marine, revealed his ability to fight in that moment. Robert hurled the teapot and cup he was holding at a few of his men as they got closer. After that, he proceeded to defeat each of his men individually. Robert quickly discovered the man he had been seeking, who was seated on a train. As he sat down, Robert patched his ripped sleeves from their previous fight and challenged the man to choose between the ordinary pain and the agonizing anguish. Robert rides into a city in a black sedan, and the clip switches to him arriving. Robert's appearance in clothing has gone through an amazing transformation. He had gotten rid of his beard and stopped wearing all white. Robert was on his way to pick up an elderly guy that morning as part of his job as a taxi driver. The man lived in an office building. Upon leaving the office, the elderly man stepped into Robert's taxi and gave him the green light to get out of there as fast as possible. Furthermore, a man named Calbert had returned from work in the Belgian capital of Brussels. Upon taking off his jackets, Calbert took a little time reaching his own way to the dining room to join his wife for their dinner. But when he entered the dining room by chance, he discovered his wife seated in terror, her face covered in persecution-related scarring. Not long after that, a group of men showed up, and one of them opened fire on Calbert's wife right in front of him. Subsequently, these unidentified individuals mercilessly killed Calbert as well. It turns out that several of the armed foreigners who stormed into Calbert's home were hired assassins sent to assassinate him and his wife. Robert, who is continuing to work as an online cab driver, is back on the scene. Later that night, a guy ordered Robert to return a woman to her apartment because she appeared to be in pain. Robert went back to the man's flat not long after that. After that, he informed the man that he had brought the earlier female passenger to the hospital due to her severe injuries. It turns out that Robert went to the man's apartment on purpose to confront the men there, believing that they were responsible for the injuries sustained by the woman he had taken to the hospital. Robert took less than 29 seconds to defeat and kill every man in the room. Robert went back to his flat after the event. One of his female co-workers, Susan, was already in his apartment when he arrived, so he appeared shocked. Robert embraced Susan tightly, as if they had not seen one another in a long time, upon realizing this. Susan, along with her colleague Dave, is one of the top CIA officers investigating a murder case involving a husband and wife. The following day, Susan, Dave, and other detectives visited Calbert at his home, which had been devastated and stained with blood from the earlier murder. By examining the scene of the crime, they are able to piece together who murdered Calbert and his wife. As Susan made her way back to her hotel room that night, a group of men she didn't know ambushed her from behind and forcefully pinned her to the wall. The two foreign men brutally rendered Susan powerless, despite her best efforts to fight back. After that, Brian called Robert out of the blue as he was chatting with a little child who was graffitiing an apartment wall. Brian, Susan's husband, contacts Robert to break the news that an unidentified guy had murdered Susan in her Belgium hotel room. Upon receiving the news, Robert wasted no time in making his way to Washington, D.C., to meet with Brian and inquire about the sequence of events. At the same time, two men in Belgium are spotted enjoying themselves, leading to suspicions that they are the ones paid to assassinate Susan. A cell phone's ringtone reached their ears not long after. A devastating explosion killed the two men as they were in the midst of answering a cell phone call. It was the same group of criminals who murdered Calbert and his wife before setting up the bomb to murder the two men. The scene shifts to Robert, who is trying to identify his partner's killer by going through the records surrounding Susan's death. Robert was able to locate surveillance footage from the hotel that captured Susan's murder. Robert then proceeded to a park to meet up with Dave. As he reviewed the hotel's CCTV footage, he noticed various anomalies, which he discussed in the chat. It was obvious to Robert that Susan's murder had been planned from the beginning. After that, Robert looks into Susan's case files to see if there's any connection to the one she was working on before her murder. Robert tries to figure out what happened at the time of the husband and wife's murder after reviewing all of the relevant documents. To figure out what could have happened that night, he put himself in the victim's shoes and envisioned himself in the dining room. Afterwards, Robert got in touch with Dave once again and informed him that the assailant who had shot Calbert and his wife was left-handed. Robert was certain that the killer had murdered Susan because she knew who killed the husband and wife. The following day, when Robert's side gig as a virtual cab driver is in full swing, a suspicious-looking and oddly behaving guy passenger is discovered by him. Robert had a correct assumption, as it turned out. As they were walking, the man unexpectedly brandished a knife at Robert. In response, Robert swerved in all directions, causing the man to lose his footing. The man was eventually elbowed multiple times. Robert quickly recovered enough to fight back, and he promptly murdered the man. Robert stole the man's phone and then promptly burned down his cab and himself to destroy any proof. Robert met with Dave the following day to fill him in on what had transpired the day before. According to what he told Dave, he had earlier contact with a man who intended his assassination. He was certain that this individual had been an agent funded by the same criminals who had murdered Susan. In addition, Robert claimed to have located the primary perpetrator's phone number after investigating the man's cell phone. When Robert dialed the number of the primary offender, Dave's cell phone started ringing out of the blue. As it turns out, Dave was the one who killed Calbert and his wife. Not wanting to be identified as the primary perpetrator of the murder case, he also murdered Susan. Robert knew Dave was the one responsible for all of this the moment he grabbed his cell phone. He wanted to ask Dave for an explanation without arresting him, so he approached him lightly. Aside from joining Robert with 3 other men accused in the deaths, Dave failed to provide an explanation for the motive behind all of the murders. Robert threatened Dave and his 3 pals with certain death before he departed. Dave and his 3 pals planned to assassinate Brian the following day when they showed up at his residence. Luckily, Robert had already rescued Brian and taken him to a secure location because he anticipated this. The story then changes to Miles painting the walls of Robert's residence. Dave and his group showed up at Robert's residence not long after to assassinate him. Miles became panicked upon realizing anything was odd and promptly reached out to Robert. While walking home, Robert quickly activated the security camera on his phone. Miles was then instructed to take cover behind the bookshelves, according to him. Miles informs Robert, upon his arrival, that he can observe Dave and his group through the secret room's 2-way mirror. Just as Dave was going to shoot the mirror, Robert gave him a frantic call, saying he was in a place Dave was familiar with. Dave and his gang wasted no time getting out of Robert's house and heading to the spot he had mentioned when they got the call. Miles, sensing that he was no longer in danger, decided to run away from Robert's residence as soon as he could. The bad news is that Dave and his friends have apparently not left the house yet. Miles was the target of Dave's gunshot. As the focus changes, we see Robert returning to a city he lived in a few years ago in his car. A major storm is currently bearing down on the city, prompting its evacuation. Not long after that, Dave and his traveling friends also reached the city. After Dave forcibly enters the town, he shoots a police officer who was protecting it. Afterwards, he and his companions reach the site of Robert's abandoned home. After arming themselves with full and modern firearms, Dave and his comrades are ready to confront Robert, a battlefield specialist. No matter how thoroughly they searched the house, Dave and his colleagues were unable to locate Robert. They were so desperate to find Robert that they broke into every house in the area and spread out. Then Dave went to a high building to keep an eye on his other 3 coworkers from afar. At the same time, his 3 coworkers wasted no time in dividing up to look everywhere for Robert. But Robert, being one of the top former U.S. military people, has planned the most effective plans and tactics to deal with Dave and his colleagues, drawing on his extensive knowledge and ability. Aside from that, he has, like in every fight before it, anticipated every possible outcome. He begins by executing Kovac, one of Dave's coworkers, by aiming the gun's arrow directly at his head. After that, Robert sneaked up on Ari, who was Dave's coworker, and proceeded to stab him multiple times. Robert proceeded to murder Resnick, another one of Dave's co-workers, after murdering Kovac and Ari. Following Susan's murder, Robert can exact his vengeance by eliminating Dave. Robert shoots at the tire of the automobile, causing Dave to miss Miles, who is being kept captive in it, just as he is about to kill him. Robert happens to be standing right in front of Dave as he attempts to locate him. After things escalated, Robert and Dave got into a violent altercation. Finally, after a lengthy battle, Robert destroyed Dave and his group. Robert retrieved Miles from the trunk of the car as soon as it was over and drove him to his residence. Robert looked at the picture of his wife and thought back on all the times they spent together in the house. At the end of the film, Miles has blossomed into a talented artist and is enrolled in art school. Thank you for coming, and don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.